Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Libby. Thanks for being here. You are at the Intersections Luncheon. Hopefully that's where you intended to be. And I'm Connie Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa. And Interfaith Alliance of Iowa is the sponsor of Intersections. And we've been holding these luncheons for, I think, 14, 15, something like that years-ish. I don't know. In Cedar Rapids, we hold a similar lunch in Des Moines as well. And we really at the core of what Intersections is about civil dialogue on important issues that are impacting our communities and our state and our world. And so we are delighted to have you here, whether you are in the room or whether you are online. So thank you very much for being part of this. It is our normal practice just to let you know that after the speakers talk for a while, then we'll open it up to questions and answers and questions and hopefully answers. And then I'll take the microphone around to you, so you'll just be able to raise your hand and I'll bring that to you. So just a note to self, you can be thinking about your questions as the speakers talk. But today we're going to talk about how bad ideas spread. I think it's an interesting title. And so the quote that was part of what you saw in our advertisement was, "We are burdening our children with national debt. College just isn't a good investment anymore. Deficits are bad." We have all heard such statements. They reflect commonly held understandings of subjects that are perennially relevant, but are they really true? So I think that's an interesting idea for us to explore. And we have two professors from Coe College who are with us today that are going to be doing the presentation. Dr. Allison Carr is the Esther and Robert Armstrong Associate Professor of Rhetoric, Director of Writing across curriculum, and Associate Dean for Student Academics at Coe College. Really? I know. And that was for all the words that you knew. Skip the rest.
She's a professor of writing. So.
Yeah, there we go. Professor of writing, teaches lots of different courses in that area and is a researcher as well. And then we have Drew Westberg, who is the Henry B. Tippie Chair in Business and Economics and the Associate Dean for Faculty Development. I think you need to add to catch up with Allison. So, Professor Westberg teaches macroeconomics at the introductory level, upper level microeconomics courses, and seminars in economic development and political economy. And so, will you please welcome Dr. Carr and Dr. Westberg? Thank you. Yeah. Are you coming up here, Drew?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having us. We're very excited to be here. I think maybe we want to start by letting you know, though we are employed locally, we are here as independent contractors today. All right. The ideas and thoughts we share with you today do not represent our employer. We want to make sure that's clear. And we want to tell you also that this presentation was hatched originally as part of our Thursday Forum series over at Coe College. Drew and I were slated to present for 8 hours on that topic. And Connie asked us if we could do it in 30 minutes. So we're going to speed run the presentation. Hopefully you'll have lots of questions for us. And I recognize many faces from that Thursday Forum, so it's nice to see you again. You want to say anything else? Oh, we have both our mics. Yeah, I think so.
Hi, what did we say?
Why is this relevant today?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if you noticed, but the government shut down.
Yeah.
And I think we have something to say about that in terms of it being a good idea or not.
Yeah.
So we'll board it up.
So we'll just leap right in. My background is in rhetoric, and that sometimes is a thorny thing to try to unpack for students. What does that really mean? And this is about the best and most succinct way I can share it with you. Rhetoric is the expression of values. When we make rhetorical choices in efforts to break through to people, persuade people, connect with people, we typically, if we're good at it, we choose language that we think will break through to our conversation partners, our audience, and help them connect to us so that we can get them on board with whatever we're trying to get them on board with. We all do this every day in every part of our lives. Okay, none of us is ever operating outside of rhetoric. Sometimes we're just doing it a little more consciously than other times. This is really important because language itself is laden, pardon me, with values. Language is often not neutral. And we can turn to George Lakoff, who's I think he's a cognitive psychologist. He's also a linguist. He researches language. He has a lot of work, and something that he tells us about, or an idea he gives us about rhetoric is this idea of rhetorical framing, which refers to a sort of dominant mode or a dominant motif that we might opt in order to explain something complex. So sort of overarching motif of a piece of persuasion, that might be a rhetorical frame, okay? And rhetorical frames are what help us know how to think and feel about a subject. So if I want to make you afraid of something, I might describe it in ways that invoke some type of fear in you. If I want to make you feel tender towards something, even that very same thing, I could choose a different frame in order to help you have tender feelings about that thing. Today we're going to talk about money, and so I want to give you an example of a rhetorical frame that at first sight might seem sort of neutral to you. How many of you have heard a politician say at some point in their campaigning that we don't have the money for whatever that thing is? Okay. How many times have you seen a political debate where candidate A says, "I promise X," and candidate B says, "How are you going to pay for it?" Right? Okay. This seems totally logical, right? This is a question we all ask in our lives every single day. We're probably asking it right now. How am I going to pay for that thing? I need to make this decision. I need to pay this bill. These costs are going up. How am I going to pay for it? It's perfectly logical because we, as regular people, depend on limited resources, right? Money doesn't grow on trees. So it's a very reasonable question for us to ask. And so when we hear politicians asking that same question from the perch of the Oval Office, it doesn't strike us as strange at all. We connect with it immediately and we sympathize with it. And we're put in a position of, well, he's got a point. We got to make some choices. We got to tighten our belts, right? Well, it turns out this is just not actually how it works. And I wish I had our slide preview because I can't remember what's next. You want to do that? Okay. So we're going to talk about it in the context of something very timely, which is the DOGE office, the Department of Government Efficiency, right? You'll remember this launching last February. Here's an example of the frame. I've already underlined the frame for you. This is an office that draws your attention to efficiency with regard to government spending, right? Do you, in your own life, value efficient spending? You strive for efficient spending in your household? That's good. I do too. We're not always as disciplined as we should be, but we make choices, right? This frame is asking you to think something very specific. It's drawing your attention to a goal. And in doing that, it's implying that a government is not actually efficient with dollars. And that DOGE's objective is to enforce or create efficiencies in government spending. Feels like a very reasonable, worthy, important goal. And we should want our government to spend our tax dollars in efficient ways. Cliffhanger. Oh, need that.
I do need this. Okay. So the basic idea here is that we're all familiar with this. This happens in our conversations all the time. These frames show up, and because they connect to our values, they stick. And this happens a lot where ideas and things that sound sensible and feel right empirically show up to be wrong. That's just not how it works, or it's not what we see in the data. Sometimes this is intentional, and they're trying to evoke an image in our minds that distracts us from the actual evidence. But other times, it's just this is the way it's always been. This is the way we've always talked about it, and so we're really familiar with these things. And so here are just a couple, and I'm sorry you can't see these, but I'll just kind of describe them. But Allison's already mentioned a couple of these. National governments, like these are things we know, right? National governments should run a balanced budget. My God, we've never done that. We never see that, but we know that they should, right? Our taxes, we know that they fund the federal government. We know they fund their spending, and so it's like this is my hard work funding that activity. But by God, it needs to be like you need to spend it on things that matter and on the things that are my priorities. We look at banks, and I'll skip that one. We can talk about that later. But then, this inflation question, which we all are familiar with at this point in time, right? We know that this all comes from too much government spending, and this is just the way that it is. This is the way that it has always been. This is what we've been taught, and it's all wrong. And so what I'm going to try to do in about 10 minutes is walk through slowly a few of these. So the first one I want to talk about is this question about taxes and the idea that our taxes fund the government. And so I'm going to ask you to just do a little thought experiment with me. And I'm going to ask you to put on your dictator hat. Okay? You can hopefully you're a nice one, but at this point, whatever you decide. Okay? One of the challenges of getting people to do things is that you really only have two choices. You can incentivize them and convince them to do it on their own, or you have to use force. And force is just a short-term solve. It doesn't actually last in the long run. And so what most societies have come up with is this idea of taxes. Well, what do taxes do? Right? Well, when we pay our taxes, we know that we have to go and get the US dollar. We got to go work for it, get that dollar so that we can pay our tax. And so the question for you is if the US dollar is what we pay our taxes in to fund the government spending, how did that dollar get in the economy in the first place? It's a thing that funds the government spending. But it only comes from one place. And you don't want to try and test this particular premise. It only comes from one place. It comes from the federal government. So if it only comes from them, and we pay our US dollars to fund its ability to spend, where do these dollars come from that we go and get so that we can pay these taxes? And the logical answer is the government must spend that money into the economy first. If it's not there to begin with, you can't go accumulate it to pay your tax. This is not chicken and the egg. This is real clear. Like this logic just gives us a real clear answer here. But if that's the case, if they must spend the money in first before the taxes can come back, then by definition, your taxes are not funding the federal government spending. They can't. Now, it's not true at local and state levels. That very much does sort of adhere to sort of the household budgetary rules that we're all familiar with. But at the federal level, if your country issues its own currency, sorry, Greece, you gave that right up. But if your country issues its own currency, it does not need your tax dollars to fund its ability to spend. It can spend when Congress says, we're going to allocate some money to this. Period. Now, there are reasons why we still pay our taxes. It requires all of us to go get that dollar, so that dollar matters. If we didn't have any reason to use it, we wouldn't, right? We're stubborn, we're fickle. We would find other things that we would use instead of this currency that the state wants us to use. But the point is that this thing is not for the purpose of funding spending. It's for several other things. It does help us with inflation. It does help us with this thing that we don't want to talk about very loudly, but the distribution of income is a really powerful tool for taxes. And so this thing is a hugely misunderstood process, but we didn't always misunderstand this. Every colony in America, the original U.S. colonies, they all had their own currency. They all issued this currency, largely for bad reasons, like sending people off to war. But they understood what it meant. You got the currency, and then you use that currency to pay your tax. And then when the colonies got these, they just burned them, right? Because they bought what they needed to buy. The government doesn't need it. So that US dollar in your pocket is simply just an IOU from the federal government that you would just replace with a different IOU if you went to cash it in. Okay. The second thing that often comes up here and is related is this notion of balanced budgets. And we've been hearing this forever. Okay, but this is related. If the government must spend the money into the economy first before we can go get it, if we want to actually use that money, it also must be in the economy. And the only way to make that happen is the government must spend a bunch of money in, and it can't tax it all back. First of all, if it does, you're all going to get really pissed. Right? You just did a bunch of work, and now you have to give it all back. But we don't do that. We tax back 30% of it, 20% of it, whatever the ratio is. And the rest of it stays in the economy. And that's the private sector. That's what we use to pursue our private sector activity. And so, and this one in particular has been really problematic because we have on both political sides of the spectrum this belief that we need to run a balanced budget. Well, remember, if I'm in, I just described a situation where I was in deficit, or if I'm the government, I've spent more in the economy than I've taxed back. And now you all, as the private sector, are using that. And if I run a balanced budget, that means I tax it all back. Or I don't spend very much in to begin with. Well, this is what happens. We've done this experiment before, and it was a very famous one. And the Democrats on this particular one ran with this forever. It was the party of, responsible government and governing. And unfortunately, it's not very responsible. What happens is that the private sector is losing money. You think of Ross Perot's giant sucking sound. He was worried about NAFTA, but really it was just the federal government taxing back more than it was spending into the economy. It was draining the resources of the private sector. It's 70% of our spending. And so it's an incredibly important group. And we were just taking money away from it. Now, what happens when we do that? Households take on debt because we spend what we spend is for as long as we can. And then we end up with debt traps, and this is really problematic. What this graph is trying to show you, by the way, is what's called the sectoral balances equation. But basically, there are just three buckets in the world for finance. There's the domestic public sector, the domestic private sector, and the rest of the world. For any one of those sectors to be in surplus, so if we're the private sector, right, if you want your bank account to have savings in it, there's only one way that can happen as a whole group, is that one of those other two sectors has to be negative. It has to be in a deficit position. Now, the rest of the world can do that for a little while, but they're just sending money back to us that we've already spent in. The only one that can do that, by the way, that's the red up there. The only one that can be in perpetual deficit and should be in perpetual deficit, the size of that deficit matters, but the deficit's critical, is the federal government, is the issuer of a currency. The purple up there, the top part of that mirror graph, is us. That's the savings account for the private sector. And so taxes don't fund the federal government. Deficits are essential. Balanced budgets aren't just, an optimistic idea. They're a bad idea. Unless you are a country that can run a trade surplus, and there aren't very many of those that are developed. Germany did it for a while, but even that train has left the station for them. you have to be in some kind of a deficit position. It's just going to be a matter of course, and that's okay. This brings us to sort of the next one, which is related to this inflation question, but this question about burdening our children with all of this national debt, right? You've heard this one forever. Okay, but think about what this is. You know, you've seen this 37, the debt clock in New York City. How many people have seen this clock? Okay, it's supposed to just scare the hell out of you. And Dr. Stephanie Kelton, where a lot of this stuff comes from, she writes this book called The Deficit. I've got a copy over here so you can see it, but I encourage everybody to go buy it. Likes to just flip the script a little bit and say that is not actually the U.S. debt clock, right? Because it's this image just reversed. It's actually the private sector surplus clock. It's just keeping track of how much money the government has spent into the economy and it hasn't taxed it back. It's how much money it is left in the private sector that the private sector is just saving in U.S. government bonds. That's it. There's nothing scary about it. The real scary question is what was done with that money. Was it productive? Were we actually doing things that matter as opposed to things that just hand wave to this notion of efficiency for efficiency's sake? And so the thing I want to sort of just, I think, and right, yeah, is I want to put this image in your mind about how money works. And again, we used to know this kind of innately. I mean, a lot of you have been around when we talked about local currencies. You've been around when you talked about sort of chamber bucks, and we talked about keeping spending local. What happens is money operates in two ways. It comes into our economy from the outside. Now, we used to think about this as big, factories exporting goods and bringing sales into our economy. That's true, but look at your public school systems. Look at your healthcare systems. Look at your city and county governments. They're all getting pretty sizable transfers from the federal government to our communities. These are outside money. And so when those things go away, this is hugely problematic. But the way this works and the way we need to think about it and get it back in our heads is outside money comes in and that money has to circulate. That money has to stay here. And if it does that, good things happen. If it doesn't do that, if it leaks out of those economies because there's not enough opportunity for me to spend my money locally, that's hugely problematic. That's the story of rural America, rural Iowa, small town Iowa. Any money that goes into those places can't stay there. They can't buy anything. And we'll highlight maybe a couple of those in a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, so back to the agency. That's our sort of thought experiment today. The rhetorical frame offered to you by that office's name, Department of Government Efficiency, positions efficiency as the goal, right? But it is not a government's job to be efficient necessarily. And I'm actually going to trouble this term here in a minute, but a government's job is not just to be efficient just for the sake of it. A government's job is, as Drew is saying, to circulate currency in order to compel certain kinds of behavior, to allow certain kinds of development of the private sector, to enforce particular kinds of norms and things like that. Money has a great social function. When we start trimming at the federal level, pulling money out of the economy, we're going to see some consequences. I said I would trouble this idea of efficiency. I think Drew can tell you more about this maybe in the Q&A, but government spending is actually incredibly efficient. Almost every government dollar comes back twofold or more in the form of economic activity generated out in the world. And I have some details to share with you about that, but we can talk about maybe some of these cuts, some of the more prominent cuts that that the DOGE office made in February and March of this past year. One big, maybe the biggest sector that got cut was health, right? big cuts to Center for Health and Human Services, HHS, and NIH, which is underneath HHS, right? National Institutes of Health. I went and found some data, some reporting on that from June. This is from the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. This is a June report. The total cuts to National Institute of Health was $4 billion, and that's the organization that funds most medical research, right? $4 billion cut there. About 20,000 positions were cut there. NIH dollars have a 2.5 to 1 return on investment. Okay, so the cost estimated by this report is that's $10 billion in lost economic activity. So we've not spent $4 billion, but as a result, $10 billion is not coming back. Got that? Not great. Not to mention the sort of the felt consequences of that, right? If you benefit from basically any kind of medicine, treatment for chronic disease, these kinds of things, there's less money going into that sector to help you be healthy, okay? USAID, another really big one. Basically, so legally not eliminated because Congress has to vote to eliminate that organization. But shredded, right? 10,000 employees severed. $28.9 billion in lost contracts. A lot of that USAID, a lot of those USAID dollars were flowing through the private sector here, right? If you grow grain, USAID is your customer because they're going to buy your grain to ship overseas. If you grow produce, that's going to help needy communities overseas. So 29, what did I just say? $29 billion in lost contracts in U.S. organizations, U.S.-based organizations. The New Yorker just yesterday or Wednesday estimated those cuts have resulted in 600,000 deaths globally. 2/3 of those deaths, children. Okay. Department of Ed, in the process of being shredded. Where do ED dollars go? Your schools are funded by state dollars, right? County dollars and federal dollars. And the federal dollars very famously fund the programs that ensure that schools have resources and that all children are educated equally, right? When your rural school loses dollars that help to support teacher development, help to support special education, help to support enforcement of civil rights laws that are related to all protected classes in the Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Is your school? How does your school deal with that? How can your community school absorb that loss? Is your state government going to step in and fix it? Not without some major revenue generation, right? More than is possible. Certainly more than would be popular, right? And so what happens? Schools have to close. If your school closes and now your children have to get on a bus to go to the nearest mid-sized city, do people want to move to your community? Heck no. They don't want to put their kid on a bus at 5:30 in the morning so they can get to school by 6:30 in the morning. Ooh, that might be an exaggeration. They don't want to put their kid on a bus for an hour-long bus ride, right? When school starts at 7:45. Where are those teachers going? Now they don't have jobs. Can they stay? Of course not. Can your now what if you own property in that town? And now there's no school. And your professional class is moving out. Now what's going to happen to your home value? Right? So we feel these things very acutely. It's not abstract. Even if we think, oh, there's so much waste in the, even if you believe this, which is not true, I think we've made it clear it's not true, but even if there's a sense that, oh my gosh, the government bureaucracy is so big. Maybe some of this work could get done with fewer personnel or more streamlined departments. There may be ways to make this work, to streamline the work of the government, to make it more labor efficient. But the dollars have to be spent in order for us to have the dollars to spend, right? And to have protection and security in our livelihoods. There we go. Just halt. We can do questions. So we want to reframe the frame.
So this is at the federal level. This is the one that is the frame that we've all grown up with, and that Allison was talking about at the very beginning. The federal government's budget is just like a household budget, and I just cannot emphasize to you enough how wrong that is. And that bad idea, because it is connected to our values and what we know, has allowed a lot of other really bad ideas to grab hold and persist. So we got to break this one first. I will take questions.
Now it's
Thank you all very much. By the way, someone in this room once described to me that he just shows up in jams, and so I've always tried to do this in my career. And so and Allison's the same way. So for us to have notes is one. And the fact that we actually stay kind of on them is a little bit shocking. All right, questions?
If you would raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you.
I may have missed this, but if the purpose of taxes is not to fund the government, then what would you say is the purpose of taxes? Is it to control inflation? Is it to control different things? What would you say the purpose of taxes is then?
Yeah, great question. So at the federal level, again, I want to just make this distinction. For currency issuers, this is the case. That taxes make sure that we all go after the state's currency. So the state wants us to do things. Your monetary system is to move people and goods towards outcomes the state wants. They don't care about the money, right? It comes out of nowhere. They make it up. They just decide what the currency is and we go use it. The taxes ensure that we're all going after it. And that has the added benefit, if we're all going after it, we'll all exchange the currency with each other in private activity. By pulling taxes out, we make sure that too much of our government currency doesn't accumulate in pockets and then inflation goes nuts, right? So we pull out a good chunk of that. There also might be some things that we don't want people doing. And so we impose those sin taxes and or maybe want to incentivize certain things. And so we can use the tax system for that. And then the distribution of income. It's really bad if you are the government, if your monetary system is designed to achieve your ends, which we hope are democratically aligned with the people that you're serving. But if somebody else accumulates a whole lot of your currency, then people are going to start doing things that they want done, as opposed to what the state wants done. And so the tax system, if it's thoughtful, should be trying to minimize any of that risk.
So talk to me about tax evasion. Where does that big hunk of money that we all hear about, if everybody paid the taxes that they were supposed to, then it would change the world, right? So what's the rhetoric that's behind the good or bad of evading paying your taxes? And then how does it affect our economy?
It's a two-part.
Well, I think it's a two-parter, but it does depend on some knowledge of the tax code, perhaps a little bit. If the government needs to extract taxes out of the economy in order to, what did you just say? Compel behavior. That's why we put money into the economy.
Yes, we all need to work.
Yes.
Be productive.
If money was abundant and we were never taxed, it would lose its value. If I'm Scrooge McDuck, do we know this one?
Yes.
Good. First, my 18-year-old's Do not know that. It's a real hard time out here for 40-year-olds. Trying to connect with the youth. If I've got a vault of money, it doesn't mean anything if it's not scarce to me. So I think in some way, and I think if you want to push against this assertion I'm going to make, please do.
Okay.
Taxes are kind of rhetorical in the sense that they I don't want to say they persuade, but they help us think of money as scarce and meaningful and help keep its value stable. But if the government, if I, get my income tax pulled out of my check every month, if the government, went to the Federal Reserve Bank and pulled out the cash sum, right, the material, the paper dollars equivalent to my taxes, and threw it in the fire, it wouldn't matter. Because what matters is I don't have it. It doesn't matter that the government has it, because they can just print new ones, right? So tax evasion, the rhetoric of that, the evasion is sinister, makes us believe that tax evasion is wrong. It is wrong in the sense that we are not all playing by the same rules, right? Which means we are not all hurting in the same way or suffering the extraction of the dollar from our pockets in the same way. To the point about if we just taxed billionaires 1% more, we could end U.S. hunger. I think it's a talking point. We could end U.S. hunger if we wanted to. Right?
Yeah, that's a great point, because this is part of this myth, right?
Or world hunger.
That we've gotten this notion that we have to tax rich people to fund programs. And it's absolutely not true. We need to tax rich people so that we don't have an out of control distribution of income, which is really not good. It depresses economic activity. It's bad for the economy to have a really unequal distribution. To your other point, Louis, is the tax evasion. If you have bad tax collections, you have a weak state, which means they're really crappy at managing themselves and performing for the people they're supposed to serve. So if you see states where there's lots of currencies floating around, not one sort of single dominant one, that's typically, not always the case, but typically it's a pretty weak state that doesn't deliver the goods.
So spending one out of every six tax dollars to pay the bonds on the debt is not a problem.
Great question. It is typically not a problem. We had a brief moment here where we actually had a little bit of stimulus coming from those bond payments, all the interest payments that were going out. But the thing that happens when we actually issue these bonds is the amount of debt we issue in a year is essentially the size of the deficit, how much money we spend in that we don't tax back. So in essence, we're pulling out that same amount, right? Because people buy those bonds. They send us that money voluntarily, not through taxes, but because they're saving. So we're actually pulling that out of the economy. That's the function of bond sales. It's not to fund the government. It's just to pull money out of the system to maintain value, to reduce inflation, but just in a way that doesn't piss people off.
We have a question from online. Someone was wondering if you have a reading list that might pertain to the subject that you could share. And if you don't have it readily available, we can put it on social media.
Yeah, we're still on our list from Thursday Forum, I think. But Dr. Stephanie Kelton's book is The Deficit Myth. If you're online, you can Google it right now. You can get it for $20. So it's a great read. She's also got some YouTube talks that are available, and you can listen to those whenever. But she's a great speaker, so strongly encourage you to go watch those too.
Howdy.
Howdy.
Thank you for helping me to stop worrying and love the deficit.
It's just with everybody. He's here all week.
Is I'm here every week. Is it possible to love this argument too much? Is it possible just to spend too much and destabilize the economy that way?
Yes, and this gets to the core. Once you take away this myth, then the question isn't about how big the deficit gets. That's not the measure or the thing we should value. That shouldn't be our standard of judgment. Our standard of judgment is inflation. If there aren't real resources for us to devote to an activity, then the government, if they just go and buy those by spending more money, that's just inflationary. So if all those resources are already allocated, then there's not much more for them to do. But there's, 7.3 million people unemployed in this country right now, and a bunch of those are not, not in that sort of short-term category where they're just in between gigs or just moving. These are people that want to find work. So we pretty typically have a lot of resources that are underused. Now, in specific industries, that may not be the case, in which case you can't go spend money there. But we got plenty of problems that we can put some more attention to.
Thank you. We're talking about misinformation, disinformation, etc. I would say that you're telling us that we have been fed this myth, in a sense. Is that correct? Given that,
I can't describe the intentionality behind it. It has certainly benefited some groups of people a whole lot more than lots of other groups.
so how do we change it?
Great question.
Really hard. It's really hard because this is really deep. If I saw you, if you had not come here today, and then we ran into each other at a coffee shop, and you said to me, "Gosh, it's too bad about the closing of our school," and I said, "Well, we only have so many dollars, right? Gotta tighten our belts. Tough times out there." You wouldn't blink, right? You wouldn't go, doesn't the government issue its own currency? Unless you already noticed, okay? It's very, very deep. This has been the line on federal spending for decades. I think when we originally were planning this forum, I think I tried to track who was the first person who put this out into the world. And I think I'd have to retrace my steps to really be confident in this. But I think it was easily early 20th century. I mean, it's at least a century old. Lakoff tells us, this is what makes it really, really hard. Lakoff tells us, if you negate the frame, you're just reinforcing the frame. So we have to come up with fresh language that does not have the shadow of the bad myth attached to it. That requires a lot of things. It requires really creative thinkers, first of all. It requires a ground game that helps to get that information out there and repeat it over and over and over again. And it probably requires some high impact direct confrontation of the myth in some way. I can tell you a very short story about it. It has nothing to do with economics, but it does illustrate the idea of how fresh language is sort of the only path for breaking through. Well, I'll give you two examples. One is about economics. Actually, Dr. Kelton's reframing of the debt, what did you call it, the surplus clock? That's pretty good, I would say. And if more of us started saying, oh, the US surplus in the domestic sector is $37 trillion. Over time, if we can be doing that in all of our communities everywhere, we might get somewhere. Okay. A very short example, and if you've been to Thursday Forum, you've heard this example, and I'll do the slimmest version of it. I'm sure if all of you are longtime Iowans, you remember the politics for permitting same-sex marriage in the 90s and early 2000s, right? To legalize same-sex marriage. When I was growing up in the 90s, the sort of casual way of talking about this activism was with the term gay marriage, right? We're talking about gay marriage, gay marriage. But I grew up in the 90s. That word gay, right, was not necessarily like, flooded with good feeling. That was a term people slung at each other with derision, right? So if people are feeling in whatever kind of way they're feeling, that's for their own reasons not supportive of same-sex marriage rights, and it's only being talked about like gay marriage, gay marriage, gay marriage, it's gonna get flooded with some negative feeling. And some very smart political communicators figured that out. And they said, how can we flood the zone? That's a Steve Bannon ism. I'm repurposing it for the good here. How can we flood the zone to make it good? Okay? To make people have tender feelings. And they went out and they did a lot of talking to heterosexual couples and asked them, what does your marriage mean to you? Why is it important? And they said all kinds of things like, my marriage helps me feel connected. It makes me feel safe. It helped me build a family. Okay? My marriage is where I find loyalty. Things like this, good values. And so the communicators figured out, okay, well, shouldn't all people have that? So they made a great pivot and they had a great ground game. And they came up with marriage equality. And you know why equality is so good? Because it is tethered to the mythology of the nation. The story of the United States, I'm saying the mythology because we know the United States has a troubled history, and this does not bear out universally. But the story that we tell about this country is that it is a place of equality. And it is very hard to say in your heart, this person, my neighbor, does not deserve the same love and protection that I enjoy in my marriage. That is really hard to have to confront the idea that if you're opposed to this thing, you are opposed to equality. It flipped a switch. Did it get 100% of support? No, but it got enough. And that's all you need in politics. You just need enough, right? So don't negate the frame. You have to find new language. That's the short answer.
So my question is, well, it's an observation. I'm a retired hospital pharmacist. So when the government says, we're going to cut Medicaid, hospitals depend a lot on that Medicaid, and also actually private insurance, because private insurers can only pay to institutions that are okay getting federal funds like Medicaid. So now you've cut the hospital, say in a rural area, so now they cannot afford to pay their staff or the electricity, so they have to close. And that means those employees now don't have money to put into the local economy. And so the schools suffer and people, so to me, that's how I relate to it. It's like a reverse trickle down. So that them withholding funds to hospitals or even to clinic visits impacts and has a whole domino effect that can kill a small town, which I think is why rural Iowans have a right to be upset. But that's how I understand it. And I think that's a good analogy, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is exactly on message here. Like when we think they're doing this out of this notion of efficiency, but the efficiency becomes the end, like it becomes the goal. And efficiency is not a goal. It is not a thing you're trying to achieve. It's just about how are you going to achieve the thing. And when that becomes the goal in and of itself, bad things happen. You know, but between the two of us, we have 5 kids. And
I just have one.
and you know, I don't live in a town where like our babies could have been born, so we had to drive out to get to the hospital. And this is everybody, and it's increasingly Northwest Iowa. I mean, I imagine it's even harder, North Central Iowa in particular, to get any kind of care like that. But these aren't questions about are there resources to do it. These are problems about the way in which we're viewing the problem. And it's generating these bad outcomes.
And just to add to that, you know, along the lines of the, you know, the efficiency cannot be an end. It's only a means. But exactly to your point, and you got it exactly right, and you're ready to take this show on the road. So, you know, talk to us after. We'll do a speaking tour. But the problem, right? Medicaid dollars help to solve a problem, right? Or help to support, right? If we're thinking about it in like very utilitarian ways. Person needs healthcare, person needs to be paid to be giving healthcare. So we have Medicaid dollars to help facilitate that, right? The problems that these dollars address don't go away suddenly because there's no money to address them. The result then is the burden is just passed. So maybe it's not only the opposite of trickle down from a financing point of view, it's sort of like a trickle down of the burden of cost, the burden of labor. If you've ever worked anywhere that was where your staff were downsized due to budgetary restrictions, the work of the place does not change typically. It just means everyone has to do more work now, right? For probably the same amount of money. So you're losing $1 every day, right? That when you're doing that extra 10% of work, or how, you know, the dollar as a metaphor there. So we can think about that, especially in our local state context, when we see legislation passing to consolidate this or that thing, or change the tax structure, or shift how the money moves around. With all sold to us or pitched to us about this is going to save you money. It's going to save you $4 on your property tax. Well, okay, but now if I got to drive an hour for my baby to be born, I might just rather have that $4 back, right? Over here. Yeah.
You were talking earlier about the cuts to NIH and USAID. Are those things that can be rebuilt, or are we going to lose too much in terms of brain drain and everything else as a result of those cuts that won't come back? I've heard of researchers, university professors, whatever, going elsewhere. People not coming in to study here because they can't get the grants they need, or they don't see that there's going to be a lab available for them to work in. How long do we anticipate all these things would take to rebuild, and is there any hope that that can happen?
Great question. I don't think we have an answer, not because, only because it's a big complex question. My understanding is these are government agencies, and just pulling the money out of the bank doesn't make the agencies go away. You need votes. It's acts of Congress that install these agencies. You need acts of Congress to eliminate them. You know, we are in a historical moment where the way that rules are meant to be followed in government are not necessarily holding, and we're not necessarily seeing a lot of challenge of that. So I don't know. It seems to me, I never want to leave a group feeling down and hopeless. It seems to me if there is some political will to start enforcing norms of government, these things can be rebuilt. I think it's a long-term project. I don't think we see, even if every single political figure, you know, if we had a sort of crazy election and everything is different a year from now or 2 years from now, I don't necessarily see that like overnight we will see billions and billions of dollars restored to these agencies. I suspect we'll hear campaigning on that, but I think it probably takes time for reasons that escape my comprehension, because I do not study politics, but not professionally anyway. But I think, what's the point? I mean, it's not a good idea to walk through the world thinking, well, there goes that, right? I guess it's going to be bad for forever, right? And we can't get it back. you know, whether we're talking about little things or big federal government things, I think if these things matter, people need to say that they matter, and they need to hold people who have power accountable and ask those questions at town halls and ask those questions of your neighbors. You know, and there are so many examples. I say this to my students all the time when they look at me hopeless because I've given them a hopeless lesson. And I say, and I'm not the first, I didn't come up with this. I'm just repeating something that activists for all kinds of causes say all of the time, which is look at the history of the world. There have been lots of really terrible times and lots of moments of change and positivity for humanity. And we have to look at those things. You have to recognize it's all of a piece, right? Other people say that more eloquently than me.
What is the effect of Elon Musk being the world's first trillionaire?
Mm.
This is going to be the most challenging question for me to be neutral on, so I'm going to try. From the perspective of what we just talked about, he has a whole lot of US dollars. To an extent that he can redirect labor in ways that no government that is the issuer of its currency should permit. Like that's allowing another private entity to essentially compete with the state for the kinds of labor it needs for police officers, for teachers, for healthcare systems, for religious systems, for civic engagement systems, all of these things that we need as society, as human society. He now has an extraordinary amount of the resource that we collectively use to try to reallocate that towards his own ends. And that seems to me to not be a great thing. I'll say no with that.
This is Interfaith Alliance is hosting it. And so from a faith perspective, I guess I have concerns with the chart of what we are established on. And I think a lot of our faith communities up to this point have been built on efficiency and excellence and performative stuff also. And so it's a cultural thing. It's like we got better and better and better and more ordered and more everything. And now, you know, that's what it is. And what you guys are talking about is messy. And people don't like, they like order better than they like mess. So how does a group that is connected to faith community, where faith up to this point it's kind of felt kind of nice and pretty and not very messy, how do we get messy in this? How can you actually say, okay, there's all this stuff and I see this chart, here's the economy things, that's how it's going to be. But the point isn't the economy. The point is the people. So what do faith communities need to do?
Slap that on a t-shirt. No, I mean, that's exactly right. This is the idea, is that if we can lift this particular constraint on our conversation and our social discussions, to Allison's point about trying to say things like something's bad when it comes to equality, now you're going to force people to say that you don't want those people to get that resource. You can't just hide behind the fact that, oh, we're broke. We don't have money for that. No, you have to actually say why it is you're going to vote against this thing. And that's a far more transparent conversation. It's scary as hell for lots of people. But that's okay. That's what faith-based groups are great. Like we're great at these conversations. This is what we do. We're all about people. And so, I mean, I think that is a great opportunity to step into the messiness and create spaces like this, where I suspect that this is not a uniform political group here, either here or online. But we have common values that are driving us to have conversations about this, and that's what's so powerful. And if we can lift some of these myths that are constraining our thinking, we can achieve some pretty interesting and I think quite successful outcomes.
I think too, my father's a minister. I grew up very embedded in various faith communities. I went to religious school. I think, you know, there's efficiency from a business standpoint when you are a cog, right? When you are you've limited dollars because you are not a sovereign bank, right? As an organization or a business or something like that. So there's efficiencies in that sense that makes sense. You want to be effective. You want to make sure people understand that when they when money comes into your system, you're using it in a way that's responsible. The government does that too already, right? And we know that because of everything we see about return on investment. I think to Drew's point and to your point about, you know, it's not about the economy, it's about people in the end, is dead on. And I think, you know, you have to forgive me, I'm like sort of chronically online, and you know, see lots of funny memes all day long, but I see a version of this one come around pretty often, and I think maybe it's germane to this conversation, which is that, you know, when people are in line to be when sick folks are in line to be healed by Jesus, you don't hear Jesus say, "I'm sorry, you haven't met your deductible." Right?
Right.
And so I think whether we're talking about faith communities or education communities or just community organizations of any kind, if your responsibility is to people, of course you want to be responsible in terms of your limited resources, but that doesn't mean sacrificing the mission, I think. If the mission is people, the mission is people. I think the government's mission is people. And I hope that that's not too radical. I hope that's not going to come back and bite me now if this is online. But I think the government's mission is people, and that's and we have to understand our relationship to the government in that way, right? If we're going to enter into this sort of contract with the government about money, we're all going to play by the rules. That the money means something, that it has a value, and that we can be compelled toward or against certain kinds of behavior on the basis of how the money flows. Then I think we ought to expect that the government is being the wholesale buyer, right? And giving us the resources that we cannot possibly acquire on our own. I hope that makes sense.
Help me to thank Professor Drew Westberg. Thank you. A lot to think about, and I'm grateful for both of your work and for presenting today. Next month, Intersections is monthly on the first Friday of the month, and next month we have Joan Flexing, who's the director of the Meskwaki Nation Department of Natural Resources. So she's going to talk from her perspective from the Meskwaki Nation. So I hope you can return, make your reservations if you would. It would be really, really helpful for the staff of the kitchen if you would take all of your trash, your glasses, the pitchers of water, all of the things off your table to that corner of the dining hall. So thank you so much, and we will see you next month.